Hello and welcome to this special episode of the Air Quality News podcast, which is produced in partnership with Zehnder Clean Air Solutions. Zehnder Clean Air Solutions, part of the international Zehnder Group, is the market leader and reliable partner for industrial air purification. Based on decades of experience, continuous innovation and a sharp sense of customer needs, Zehnder Clean Air Solutions develops solutions that ensure clean, healthy air in a wide variety of businesses. The spectrum of industries ranges from metal processing and building materials to logistics and packaging, as well as the food and pharmaceutical industries. Joining me today is William Burrows from Zehnder Group and Keith Cotton from Crisp Air, and we will be discussing air pollution in the workplace. William is technical project lead for the North West England and Ireland for over 6 years. He has led the revolution for businesses to take note when presented with solutions that improve not only indoor air quality, but also the processes within their organisation. William brings a boots on the ground mentality to our discussion, highlighting the enemy we face now and in the future. Keith is Managing Director of Crisp Air, a consulting company that focuses on creating sustainable value to the environment, community, workforce, and the organisations. He has worked in air pollution for over a decade, mostly with local authorities and businesses on ambient external sources and solutions, but more recently on indoor workplace pollution. Keith brings a wealth of practical and scientific experience to our discussion today. And finally, I'm Martin Guthrie-Hewitt, the editor of Air Quality News magazine. First of all, thank you both for joining us. One of the things that we were excited to speak to you guys about in particular is the kind of reasons why indoor air quality, first and foremost, should be treated as of equal importance when compared with outdoor air quality, and also some of the reasons why perhaps that's not as widely understood by the public.
Well, thank you for that, Martin. I can come in on that. I mean, from my experience, and just to start, I think what people aren't aware of is that it's equally important as outdoor air quality, because there's actually less clean air available to anybody who works in an indoor environment. If you take you or I, we sleep 7-8 hours a day, right? And then you take the other 7-8 hours of that day, you're actually indoors working. So we don't have the benefit of external air caressing our lungs in a sense, and effectively you're tied to that environment for that length of time. So if you add into the fact the different exposures that you can get in those working environments over the timepiece that you invest in your occupation. And I see it with many of the different businesses I go into, where people will sit in the same spot for 7-8 hours a day, do the same job. For example, spreading flour on a pizza. That might just be the most simplest example, but that's just an exposure for 7-8 hours a day. They will have extraction kit, they will have materials that actually help reduce the exposure, but it's over that time period. If you've got a local area where everybody works 5, 10, 15, 20 years and the staff turnaround's low, then these people will be affected in the long run, and that's in your indoor environment. So that's why I think it's equally important, just as outdoor air quality is.
Yeah, and I think Keith, just to maybe bring a kind of an outdoor to indoor example in terms of regulations. Yeah. In your pizza factory, the office manager, the operations manager will have ventilation, tick, and it's just done. Maybe not looking at the level of ventilation, quality of any filtration. Just like with the outdoor, say, construction environment is a perfect example where dust suppression is mandated on certain activities. Now I've walked past construction sites and there's someone in the far corner of the site with a hose dribbling on the floor, making absolutely no difference to suppressing dust. But for the contract manager, dust suppression, tick. And really what we need is principles rather than just checklist outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The air quality conference that we hosted in London a couple of weeks ago, indoor air quality was an issue that was brought up in terms of building design. One of the things that was kind of reiterated there is the awareness change, I guess, that's taken place in terms of, kind of post-pandemic, and obviously the importance that was placed on air quality within that and ventilation. I mean, do you think that public awareness is improving and also business awareness, Keith?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Knowledge is key. And I remember a few years ago when public health went to the auspices of the local authorities, and I was at a presentation with the new director of public health, and she was a doctor and a very well-known physician. And I had a chat about air pollution to her, and she said, "Oh, you mean mold in poorly ventilated buildings?"
Right.
I said, "No, that's actually not not really what I meant. And that's a director of public health. I think that awareness, certainly of ambient external air pollution, has increased, certainly in London, with the campaigning work that's been done across the board. I take a little bit of credit for a tiny bit of that. But largely, indoor workplace air pollution is ignored. The pandemic certainly did raise attention to it, but just like with our own attitudes towards COVID, I think it's largely been ignored again.
Faded away over the months of re-emerging from lockdown, as it were.
Absolutely.
How about you, William?
There's a startling difference when you look at the data. And that's where, when you compare outdoor to indoor, I mean, you can get higher volumes of indoor air pollution, but in many different forms. But studies highlight that you can have low volume in a bad contaminant, but high volume in a contaminant that's not as bad. But the question there is, what is that actually doing to us as people? What we subjected to in those environments? I mean, The Guardian in 2016 did a study, and what they did was they outlined toxic outdoor air. So the study was in toxic outdoor air and nanoparticles. Now, what they found was that the nanoparticles were found in the lungs and brains of people who'd passed away, right? Now, you can't tell me that that wouldn't be the same case if somebody passed away and they'd worked in a certain environment all their life, that wouldn't be the case for indoor air quality. There's many different contaminants. The King's College of London did a study at the roadside, and what they did was they actually studied how bad the roadside was over a 10-year period. Now, the level and volume, 25 micrograms per cubic meter was the average over a 10-year period. I can go into my environments in a standard logistics environment, and the levels are at 167.
Wow.
So that gives you the startling difference, because when you put it in a box and contain everybody, you can see that there's a significant difference there. And bearing in mind, they're saying people should shut their windows in London. All the headlines were saying, keep your windows closed. You've got to remember that those levels are at 25 micrograms. So that's quite low. When I go to businesses and see those volumes, it's startling. So, I mean, this is why it's not apparent to everybody.
Keith?
Yeah, and certainly, hold your breath if you're on the Northern Line, for example. I did some work with Islington Council a few years ago, and I took a little PM 2.5 monitor with me, and, walking around outside, it's, 25, 30, as you'd expect around Archway. On the Northern Line heading home, 450.
Wow.
Now, okay, so my exposure was only for 10, 15 minutes, but that certainly was an unpleasant experience. The regulations in terms of what is considered safe indoors and outdoors are very, very different. I mean, it was only I think it was 2011 that the Scientific Advisory Committee on Toxic Substances, and as the HSE, said that the current levels of guidelines for dust were way too high. And yet nothing has been done about it, about changing the workplace emission limits.
I mean, you both mentioned, I suppose, taking action into your own hands, as it were, with monitoring indoor spaces. Certainly people in the space, anyway, are very aware of the number of projects that have looked at outdoor air quality and gauging levels of particulate matter and other pollutants in the air outside on an ambient level. How far behind is the research in terms of indoor air quality, in terms of kind of large-scale studies?
When you talk about exposure limits, this is key for me, because there's not been significant reclassifications on a high percentage of the contaminants since the 80s.
Right.
So you take, for example, now in 2022, there's still contaminants that have the same level of what they were classified as back in, I think it was 1984 or 1985, that are still the same today. Now, like Keith said, that level, what you've measured, general dust level, is designed at 10,000 micrograms per cubic meter. The World Health Organization says that anything above 50 micrograms per cubic meter isn't good for you, right? The UK legislation in the EH40 says that 10,000 is okay for generalized dust. So can it be reclassified? Yeah, but that takes time, significant funding. Now, government bodies focus on major contaminants and a percentage of those industries where the contaminants are dangerous. So what seems to happen is there's a cycle by the health authorities that follow like Breathe Easy campaigns. And what they'll do is they'll select silica, welding fumes, MDF, these kind of contaminants, because they are the nasty ones, right? And they do these Breathe Easy campaigns, and they go around these companies, they go round about the houses. But what I'll say for it is that it's heavily underfunded. So the exposure limits for most businesses might be met, But my point is, at what cost if some of the other contaminants are not reclassified? Because all the businesses can do is follow their guidance.
Yeah. Okay. That's alarming. Interesting. But
That is alarming. You're right.
Yeah, it really comes down to kind of awareness raising. And I did some workplace monitoring a year or so ago in a number of different settings. And there was one which was a vehicle maintenance unit. It had massive, great big barn doors. And then the warehouse kind of went back and on forever. There were clear spikes in activity, seemingly randomly throughout the monitoring period of a week. And when we backtracked and looked at it, it was when they were doing the tailpipe emissions testing for vehicles during their MOT. Now, that didn't require necessarily any additional ventilation. What it did require is to move that activity to by the doors. So you've got immediate natural ventilation taking that pollutant away. If you didn't look for it, you wouldn't know. But quite frankly, if you're doing an emissions test, you're going to know that there are going to be, surprise, surprise, emissions. And therefore, it doesn't take rocket science to work out that we might think about doing that somewhere else where there's better ventilation. So awareness raising and the practical application of common sense would go a long way. In certain systemic manufacturing environments where there are ongoing pollutants constantly generated, then yeah, you're going to need some active filtration and better ventilation. But in many cases, it's just a case of looking at what's happening and going, oh, there's going to be a problem there. Another slight problem that we've got in this space is that there aren't directly comparable regulations between indoor and outdoor air pollution. So DEFRA look after the ambient external stuff, and the HSE is supposed to look after the indoor workplace stuff, but there aren't any direct comparisons. The only comparison I could sort of find, and I had to sort of force this together, was there's a slight diagrammatic comparison for respirable dust, which the HSE use. And it's the workplace COSH regulations, reference BSEN 481, determining respirable dust as 10 micrometers in diameter and below, with a median diameter of 4.3 microns. Very specific. And there it says it needs to be below 4,000 microns per cubic meter as an average. Well, that's massive compared to the ambient external limits. And that's even before DEFRA come up with their new ones, which we were expecting last month.
Keith, I totally agree with you in the points in terms of the scale and how big that is. And you're trying to make a comparison between indoor and outdoor, and there isn't much that's very apparent. Now, that's because studies cost money. They cost time and effort. We need a study, for example, a worker in a set environment over a 5, 10, 15, 20, 25-year period, right? Where he's working in that environment consistently. But here's the thing. What we've got to be aware of is that it doesn't matter how small the particle is, because the smaller the particle, the more it affects your health over the protracted length of time going forward. And that's the point. You could be subject to quite minuscule amounts, but over a protracted period of time, that will impact your health. No having a comparison between indoor and outdoor. Did they want it? Is that a question? Is that even a question? Did they want that comparison for the businesses?
Yeah. Yeah. And how about the types of pollutant that people are being exposed to? I mean, we've referenced a couple earlier on in the conversation, but if you can just kind of talk me through the most common types of indoor pollution that people need to be aware of.
I see it from all spectrums. So, right, you've got welding fumes. That's been reclassified recently because it's a carcinogen and it causes cancer. So they dropped the level. Now get this. When I started in this industry 6 years ago, the level in a welding environment was classified as general dust, 10,000 micrograms per cubic meter. The level now, zero tolerance. Actually, if you've got fumes, you must manage it. You must have extraction equipment. You must have levels that manage it. Now, what they said was back in 6 years ago that 10,000 was a level. If you were 1/3 of that, you should have a look at that. That doesn't say that the health and safety executive wouldn't batter down your door and stop you from working. But what they would say is that you should be taking a look to take steps to manage that better. So that ranges from welding fumes. Now, you can imagine the UK is quite abundant in terms of that. You then go into the food industry where you make everyday foods that we are in. So whether it's cheese or whether it's cakes, Thai food tea is one of my biggest customers. So they blend tea dust. So they used to make tea leaves. Now they use tea dust to make price point tea bags, which you can imagine if you're just blending dust, right? That dust in itself, I mean, it's corrosive. It's not good when you breathe it in. It's unsightly. And what we find is those contaminants might be there, but when we approach a business, they're actually looking to solve their dust problem, not initially their air quality problem.
Yeah.
So that's the disparity, because I can save somebody time on cleaning, but actually the back end of that, everybody breathes a little bit better in that environment. And that's where I think as a country we need to get to. We need like a hygiene rating that you get for a kitchen or a restaurant or a business where it's 1 to 5. We need that for businesses. We need a hygiene rating where if you're going to work for a company, their air quality rating is 1 or 1 star or 5 stars. Or does that attract people? Does that market their company better? Does that put them in a better standing? I think that's got traction where people are aware that if you're going to work in a company, they've got a standard of air quality that they adhere to, and they put resources into maintaining.
That's absolutely a fantastic idea. My only worry is that, your local authority, which would probably be mandated to enforce that, would say, can we have some more people then, please? This is ultimately where it comes down to. Partly it will be a lack of wanting to shake the business tree too much for fear that it'll fall over, but also the fact there really isn't sufficient resources going into the HSE, both in terms of defining what regulation should be and in terms of practical enforcement. That's ultimately where we are now. I mean, we know, Martin, from history, that if you want change, the best way to do it, or the quickest way to do it, is legislation. It might not actually be the quickest. I mean, now, of course, we have social media. That seems to ensure things change pretty quickly if there's enough people behind it. But as with the Clean Air Act following the 50s smogs, legislation works.
And is there much hope in terms of sectors, industries, businesses themselves taking the action into their own hands without that hand being forced?
From my side, I've seen pretty positive moves going with the construction sector, but that's obviously largely, almost exclusively, still outdoor air pollution. So the reason that industry sector has changed is linked to the more effective monitoring and enforcement of statutory nuisance from a local authority perspective around construction activities. And they have actually now been pretty proactive in terms of those dust suppression farces that I described earlier. There's much more proactive following of principles rather than just checklist regulations now. So I'm positive for that. But as I say, that's not indoor workplace air pollution.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't want to get bogged down there being kind of a bit negative on some of the bad parts and the ugly parts. So when we talk about businesses, it's nice to talk about the good parts as well. I always look at it as if the water in the tap was dirty, right? Quite simple. If the water in the tap was dirty, would you drink it? No, you wouldn't. Okay. So it's the same for air quality. The difference is you can't see it, right? Yeah. That's how we don't know. So we can't put a finger on, is it bad or is it good? So for me, what people don't actually know is like the standard air quality. They did studies in 2016 with the Guardian. Clean air actually makes you smarter, right? It actually makes you smarter. So if you've breathing clean air on a consistent basis, your mental capacity and focus is much better than of an environment that is less clean.
Yeah.
Because when we go into the business, as I said before, they want to solve a problem with a dust problem or a challenge or a contaminant and reduce that. And that aids their process, their quality, or their some sort of production benefit, okay? And it makes them more efficient, right? And the back end of that, the staff breathe cleaner air. But what you've got to remember is in an environment where you've got a cleaner working environment, you've got improved skin, better digestion, psychological and emotional stabilizing benefits. You actually get better moods. You get a better sleep. You have staff taking less sick days. And what that also does is, in the back end, it increases productivity. You increase the air quality in an environment, you get productivity increases. The problem is you can't put a figure on it. You can't put a number on it and say, this will give you X. But from what we know and what we see in the data out there, it will have efficiencies and improvements. So are there proven benefits to clean air? Yeah, definitely. That for me, where it might just seem like a nice thing to do, it's actually, I think, in my case, a need to do. For some of the places I've visited, and I can't name them for obvious reasons.
Okay. I mean, while we've been talking here, one thing that's kind of kept springing to my mind when we're discussing the need for hearts and minds to be won and more awareness to be created around indoor air quality. I mean, if we kind of consider what happened with smoking and passive smoking adverts when I was growing up, which I think is probably the most visible example of a kind of wholesale change in people's attitudes towards indoor air quality. And I'm just wondering, at what point should we be calling on the government to start coming up with campaigns that are actually just as kind of visually arresting to try to get people and business owners, employees to start actually thinking about this properly. You know, obviously, like you say, in terms of proof of concept, as it were, in terms of benefits of improved indoor air quality are quite difficult to present in a financial, economic kind of way, but in a health context, perhaps easier to present. Keith?
Yeah, I think that's the critical thing, because let's face it, improving air quality inside a workplace environment is a cost. It's as simple as that. So it can't be necessarily always presented as a cost-benefit analysis. It is a public health issue. And I think what would be useful, the first thing is to establish safe levels for a variety of different pollutants. And it could be classified simply as dust, with some notable exceptions like welding fumes, comparable with the outdoor air pollution levels. Now, what would be nice to see would be, therefore, at that point, the production of an air quality standard. And it could even be, to start off with, a voluntary standard, but for government contracts, and that's quite a lot of things, it would be mandated. And it would be the responsibility of the manufacturer or workplace that were providing services to government contracts to prove that they had materially improved indoor air pollution. This is leaping into the dreamland days of the future. I'm aware of that, and I think that a voluntary indicator, as Will brilliantly highlighted, like the food standards on a restaurant, it would be a wonderful first step, because, you know, the future of work research that's been done has shown that sustainable, healthy environments are up there with salary for employees.
In terms of the importance.
Certainly of the younger generation. So if you're an employer and you're fishing around, you don't want to limit the size of the pond you're fishing in to get the best staff. But this will require, hopefully discussions like this to motivate that and get things started. But maybe we can talk offline about taking it to the next level.
I totally agree with Keith there. And this is where I take my experience, and it saddens me, right? Because I've done this for 6 years, and this comes down to a thing in the UK, and I think the culture in the UK is a little bit different. And hear me out and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've always noticed is that businesses have seen as make money first, and the people generally seem just a close second, right? Okay. Unless enforcement takes place, like legislation, like the welding fumes going from zero tolerance, okay, where you have to do it. The other side of it is, I see some different markets across Europe where it's people first, business secondary, right? That is very, very apparent, because a lot of the counterparts in the Nordics and Germany and Central Europe, they adopt our solutions for the air quality for people. That's one of the primary number one reasons for going into that business and putting our solutions into their environments. So that's really quite good to know in a sense, but I think there's got to be a culture change. If you could show me one major group in the UK who decides, do you know what, we should have the best air quality, clean air that anybody can provide, and we can adopt that into all our sites, I'd be sitting here with a winning lottery ticket, but I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening. And I've been doing this for 6 years, because we did say we'll be on a crest of a wave sometime where the domino will fall, and what will happen is these businesses will just adopt into it. I think it's changing though. I think, like you said, Keith, people are aware. They don't want to go and work in environments. I can give you an example of a company who the difficulty is that they were spending a lot of money on recruitment. They'd bring these people in, train them up. It was in a logistics environment, train them up. And what would happen is, after 6 months, they'd leave fully trained and go and work in a nicer, cleaner warehouse. So that recruitment cost was the main reason they put the solution in to reduce the dust and improve the working environment.
Interesting. Yeah.
That to me is startling, because the cost to actually recruit is very, very costly. And if you're always having a revolving door of people leaving and going to a nicer warehouse where it's cleaner, you're kind of giving it back consistently. There's got to be some sort of return on investment for the businesses when I go into them. That's what they see. It's a personal win for me that the back end, if they adopt our solution, that people still benefit. There has been a few companies who have said, and I can say to yourself, there's a companies who do, and I've dealt with people who actually have said to me, look, it's actually good because everybody's breathing a little bit better in here. And that's my primary contact. And that sounds lovely. That sounds really nice. And it's a bit music to my ears. That's a wee personal one for me, because I know that do you know what? You might save time in your cleaning and it saves you a bit of money in the background. But actually, all the people in here are going to be a little bit better off with a solution and breathing a little bit more clean air.
A part of the jigsaw puzzle that we haven't talked about yet is the unions. And it very much depends on the briefing of the union safety reps in terms of their awareness of air pollution as an issue. And also, of course, of the relationship between the union rep and the management of the organisation. But there's a potential useful partnership that can be drawn there, not in a conflict or adversarial way, purely in a mutual beneficial way, as Will says, in terms of maintaining a stable workforce for an employer is a benefit. That is another angle that certainly should be pursued more.
That's a really interesting point, and I have to say one that I'd never actually considered before. But I mean, in terms of where the unions are on this, I mean, are there any that are more proactive when it comes to indoor air quality than others? I'm just thinking, fundamentally their role being to support and to advocate for people that are working within their industry. So you would think that the health of that workforce is going to be a priority for them.
Yeah, there's an organisation set up called the Trade Union Clean Air Network. They are signed up to by all of the major unions in the UK.
Right.
And they do hold a number of various forums, and there's some very, very good people there. The issue is getting that message out to a union rep who maybe feels that they're not enabled enough to talk to their management. Maybe they don't feel technically qualified on the air pollution issue to be able to address things. There's certainly a knowledge and an information gap there. But yeah, that organisation exists. It is set up. It's just whether it gets the traction it needs over other health and safety issues in the workplace. That bit is uncertain.
When we talk about unions, I've had a few businesses where we did integrate solutions in where the unions were heavily involved. And it was quite interesting to notice that when they are involved, it is all for them, right? And we do agree. And what we find is that it gets to a breaking point where the workforce is going to down tools in a sense. Companies sometimes then just go, right, well, we can't stop production, so we need to kind of do something to improve in here. And for me, it shouldn't get to that point, right? Like Keith said before, morally, ethically, they do have a kind of duty of care to their staff anyway. Take unions aside, I think the workers and you or anybody else in these environments, you or I need to protect ourselves. We need to actually be aware that bringing that topic of clean air to senior management, when you put pressure on them, they have to respond and they have to react in a certain way. I'll find that companies will bring this up and people will talk about a challenge. They go to the top senior management, they're below the level, so why do they need to do something? And this is the question I put to them. I'll say, look, you go to your senior management, you record your levels and you're below the levels. Why would you do something now? Well, what he'll say is that he's had that challenge for 25 years in some instances. So he's had the same dust problem for 25 years. Like you said, Keith, extraction, tick. We've got the extraction. It's fully working and fully operated. Tick box. And what happens is we've still got all this dust everywhere else or contaminant that everybody still breathes in. And we've had that problem for 25 years and we've never had a solution that actually improves that. Because as well as every extraction equipment and solutions that actually reduce the contaminants that are presented, there is a high percentage that does escape and everybody will be subjected to it. We've done testing and get this right. This will shock you. And it goes back to your point when you say passive smoking. How does the smoke know? Okay. So we've done testing in a welding bay. And the reason why I use that is because the guy in a welding bay who welds at source has an air-fed mask on, right? He is blowing the fumes away from himself. He is fully protected, right? The fumes are then, he might have an extraction torch, which will take a percentage of the fumes away. And we tested the fumes in that area. And what we did was we took that monitor and also tested it in the walkway in the building. What do you think the level was? What do you think the difference was?
Wincing and guessing very, very high.
It was double.
Wow. What's the cause of the double?
Well, that's just the natural airflow of that building, right?
Yeah, right.
But what it tells you is pedestrianism of contaminant is an actual thing, right? Pedestrianism in a sense where if you're walking down and you're not the guy who welds, you will still be subject to some sort of contaminant double the amount of the guy, if he took his mask off in his welding bay, he's more safe in that welding bay than the guy who's walking down the production hall who doesn't weld or doesn't do main contaminant welding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of a situation like that, I mean, this must be, I know obviously the building design and the airflow of a specific location massively plays a factor in this, and it's going to be impossible to kind of come up with a one-size-fits-all answer here. But I guess within a situation like that, I mean, what are the possible solutions to improve in that situation? Because I think that there is likely to be very few people that would have expected the results to be severe.
Yeah. The idea is it's not a one-size-fits-all. You're right, Martin. It's a combination of things. Here's the point. You can have positive pressures all through a building, and they'll direct where the airflow goes, and they'll direct where the contaminant goes. Now, what you've got to remember is that when we record statically at head height. So that's where you would walk. If you walk in that direction at your head height, you breathe that in, right? Now, solutions to improve it, you can have on source, percentage will still escape because you've got a percentage of efficiency that equipment will reach. Then you have to manage the wider working environment, either through ventilation, where you're taking the air outside the building, filtering it and bringing it back in, or the others would be filtration, which would be air scrubbing. In a sense where you hold the contaminant in a filter and you push clean air back in. The problem is a lot of the tick box exercises is for extraction. Now, extraction is just to take away from the source. You get that contaminant taken and put somewhere else and left, where in which the solutions that we look at are putting clean air back in. So it's actually about the air quality. It's not just about taking away from the source. We can take it and manage it, but you want to give something back and make sure that somebody breathes a little bit better in that environment.
Yeah, there is an acknowledged and well-defined hierarchy to reduce air pollution in a workplace environment. It starts with elimination, in other words, removing the process that's causing the air pollution. Then there's the substitution. Can you change the materials that you are using to produce less of the contaminants which are polluting the air? Then obviously there's engineering controls, which, as Will said, is basically filtration, air scrubbing, ventilation, and the last resort is PPE, where people have to wear protective equipment. But as I say, the guy that's welding or the lady that's welding, they might be fairly safe and secure, but the person wandering past most certainly isn't, because that contaminant has accumulated in a certain pocket because of the airflow of the building.
And I mean, we've talked about some very specific examples of workplaces that are associated quite heavily with either fumes, emissions. What about in situations that are perhaps a little bit more discreet in terms of their indoor air pollution problems? I'm thinking about, kind of offices in densely built up areas and things like that. I mean, how much of a concern is that for people?
In office buildings, there are different types. It's not so bad. Obviously, the air is filtered. You normally have pad and bag filters on the air handling units, which does deliver relatively clean air inside the working environment. So no, I mean, for office workers, their biggest exposure is getting to work and wandering off for lunch, certainly in central London, until they can return to the relative safety of their office. But, a lot of companies are doing really good things with greenery inside the building. It's not just a nice thing to have, it does improve air quality.
Yeah, okay. And as kind of last thoughts on the conversation here, I'm just wondering, both of you, as individual air quality professionals, as it were, in terms of our initial kind of first next step forward, if you will, what would be the most significant either one of you would like to see right now?
For me, the most important thing is for publications like your good selves to get the message out there that we need to be talking about indoor workplace air pollution. We need to get that conversation started. That's how you shift the inertia of government into doing something.
Well, we'll certainly try our best.
I agree with you there, Keith, and that's quite nice, actually, coming from you working in outdoor pollutions and outdoor environments for such a long time. Do you know that? Because in the same breath that you've been doing and focusing on outdoor environmental pollutions, that's all been going on at the same time, which when you think about it in that sense, it's always been there. We've got to think about what the business looks like in the future. Now, the COVID era allowed a lot of businesses to stop and think. So what they did was they stopped and thought, how do they streamline their processes? right? Now, what's going to happen is, and we see this in logistics, we see this in many businesses where automation is becoming a thing. We know that anyway. Automation is quite big in some industries, but when businesses had a time to stop and think, automation was a way forward, and it allowed them to integrate it. Now, that was for financial gain, of course, because when you automate something, you maybe don't need to employ that member of staff to look after that. But what that does is, who's to say that you can't automate your air cleaning? Who's to say that you can't automate your air quality? Because you can. You can certainly make a difference. And that's where I think there'll be pushback, but that foundation that was built in COVID has allowed them to think about it. And for me, I see this as being a way for cleaner air moving into the market, whether that's commercial, private, retail, transport. The landscape of how we look at indoor air quality will change for the better. And I think it's a matter of time. I don't think it's too far in the future, but I think as maybe more studies and more people are aware, you might just get your everyday worker getting his haircut and his barber's mentioning indoor air quality. Do you know what I mean? These are the kind of things. Once your barber starts mentioning it, you're getting a haircut, that's when you know it's reached the masses, you know? I think we're not too far off. I think the dominoes will fall, but yourself, Martin, can only aid us in that quest as such.
Fantastic. Well, Keith, William, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'm probably going to get my hair cut now and start a conversation with the barber. See how that works out for us. But yeah, this has been the Air Quality News podcast in partnership with the Zehnder Group.